And the classic one, which you'll know about very well, is the Aizuchi effect. So the Japanese person's constant nodding of their head doesn't mean yes. It just means, yes, please go on. Or, yes, I'm hearing you. I mean, that's a very useful one to learn, isn't it? Because you do hear people visiting from overseas say, well, they seemed incredibly positive. I'm thinking, no, they were just saying, come on, get to the end of your conversation or whatever. So I think that's another good one.
こんにちは皆さん。ビジネスサクセスジャパンのポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Liddy Buchelman. My main goal here is to create an easily accessible resource for those who want to develop Japan-specific communication skills, especially in business. While I don't promise to make you fluent in Japanese, I hope that you will walk away from each episode with a skill, piece of information, or shift in mindset that will help you be more effective in your interactions with Japanese business people. Also, one quick note to let you know about what's been going on recently with the popular new social media app, Clubhouse. It's not only blown up in Japan, but the community of foreigners who work in Japan or with Japanese companies has been growing lately as well. So, if you have an iPhone and are interested in joining in on the conversation, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com to see if I still have some invitations to share. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. A quick reminder to please rate and review the podcast if you enjoy it. It goes a long way to helping others find the podcast and learn more, and it also helps me to keep going as an independent creator. So, thanks in advance. In today's episode, I'm chatting with David Tonge, a designer and owner of the London-based design studio, The Division, who has worked extensively in Asia and in particular has a long relationship with Japan. David has 30 years of experience as a designer, director, and advisor to some of the world's most successful brands. He's also a visiting professor at Kanazawa Art University in Japan. But David will share a lot more about that in today's conversation, so be sure to stick around to learn more. Before we get into the interview, let's go over a little bit of Japanese. In the previous episode, we learned the word hansei. Ha-n-se-i. Hansei. Hansei essentially means reflection, contemplation, regret, or even repentance. Be sure to listen to my episode with Tim Sullivan to learn more about this word and why it's such a fundamental idea in Japanese culture. Today, I want to briefly highlight another important concept in Japanese business culture that David brings up during the podcast. O-to-shi-do-ko-ro. 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 A possible translation for o-to-shi-do-ko-ro is the place where things fall. What it really refers to, however, is a point of compromise or common ground. So in a business negotiation, for example, both sides should work towards this point of compromise, or o-to-shi-do-ko-ro, in order to reach a consensus and preserve the relationship. But without any further delay, let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and my audience. Would you mind just taking a quick moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is David Tonge, and I'm an industrial designer currently based in the UK. And in case you're wondering what industrial design is, this is often a question I get asked. So it's not designing factories or that kind of industrial thing. Traditionally, it's about designing anything which is mass manufactured. So, and it's, again, changing these days, but it used to be much more about designing the shape, color, material, usability of a product. And it could be anything from a watch to a car to aeroplane, whatever. So wide range of things.
So could you tell us a little bit about your history with Japan specifically?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a circuitous route, really. So in 1996, I moved to San Francisco to work with a very well-known design company called IDEO Product Development. And at the same time, they had just opened an office in Tokyo. And so not many months after moving to San Francisco from London, I found myself on a flight to Japan. And I think like many people who go there, particularly not solely creative people, but particularly for creative people, it's a really fascinating place. And so I fell in love with it really after that visit. And then after that, I found myself very regularly going back and forth to the Tokyo office to help them out with projects. And bit by bit thought, well, I better learn a bit of Japanese if I'm going to keep doing this. And then, of course, bit by bit, started to understand the culture a bit more, fumble my way through the language. Butcher the language is probably the best way to put it. But anyway, manage and meet more and more people, meet more companies, those kind of things. Yeah. And then around about that time, I also started to learn Japanese with a small school in San Francisco. So this was sort of beginner level Japanese, learned hiragana, katakana, the first couple of 100 kanji, that kind of thing. And learned how to introduce myself and deal with all of those things which at the time seemed really complicated, like kore, sore, are, things like that, which I can't believe now that seems complex, but at the time it was what's this all about? But so that's how it started. And then since then, I'm one of those people that's never lived permanently in Japan, but spent a lot of time there on long visits and so on. And I think to date, I stopped counting how many times, but it's been well over 100 visits to Japan since that point. So it's been a constant part of my life since then. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So you did explain to us a little bit about what industrial design is.
Yeah.
But could you tell us a little bit more about the type of work you're doing right now specifically?
Yeah. So in 2003 with my wife, we were still living in San Francisco at that time, but we founded a company called The Division. And part of the reason was that we'd always worked in quite large companies and we just had enough of that and wanted to do something smaller, which was more related and closer to our clients. And the client base is probably about 80-90% Japanese clients. So we work with them in a number of different ways. The most straightforward way is just on design projects. So for example, a company like Soji who make flasks, or in Japan they call them mahobin, so magic flasks. We might help them just create the new shape of a flask, which, for example, most recently we designed for the European market. So in that case, it's about taking some elements of Japanese culture and using them to communicate and design in a way that's appealing for European consumers. That might be a most straightforward way. We also do it for the Japanese market as well. But lately we find ourselves doing a lot more of working with companies to educate them in new processes, new ways of doing things, typically Western ways of thinking about design, Western ways of thinking about brand, those kind of things. So it's slowly, probably with age more than anything, and a little bit more wisdom, it's becoming much more advising and that kind of thing. That's a sort of spectrum of things that we do, and an awful lot in between as well.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So would you mind digging a little bit more into how you kind of take those elements of Japanese culture and try to make them appealing to other countries? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It also goes the other way as well. I mean, lately, particularly with the world we're living in at the moment, where basically I can't get on an aeroplane, and as much as we all love Zoom, to communicate in a meaningful way with a company is quite difficult, to do that. So we're actually switching our work to help American and UK-based companies to export to Japan. But to answer your question, so we work with, Zojirushi is a good example. Toto is a good example. Shiseido is another good example, where we try to help them understand the elements of Japanese culture, which we as Europeans or Americans, English-speaking country people, I suppose. What are the elements that they understand to be Japanese? So, which of course is a naturally more limited set of cultural elements, if you like, than the Japanese themselves might understand to be Japanese. So But in relation to design, it's often about craft. It's often about material or shape or, those kind of things. Yeah, so in the case of a company like Zodirushi, in the last piece of work we did for them, we designed a flask for them, and the basic idea of the flask was they would use the shape of byobu, so folding screens. And so it's a very faceted shaped flask, and it's using materials, reds and golds and bronzes and those kind of colors which reflect on, I should say, Japanese materials. And then at the same time, we also designed the exhibit stand for them, which was a relaunch for them in Europe. And so the exhibit was using a lot of wooden lattice form, which, as you know very well, if you wander around a place like Kyoto or other area, you see a lot of this lattice, this kind of use of wood, make a kind of open framework. And again, that's another thing which has become understood to be a sort of element of Japanese craft and architecture outside of Japan. Another example might be a company like Toto, who, as you probably know, have these incredibly technology-enabled bathrooms. So they're making washlet toilets, these incredible things that not only measure your weight, which is a bit scary really, but also automatically flush, automatically do all of these kind of things that they do, which is still, relatively new outside of Japan. So in their case, we're helping them to understand the aspects of technology which will be acceptable to people outside of Japan, but without removing the sort of unique quality that those products have and that are very uniquely Japanese. Think about the other way, exporting into Japan, then we do a lot of work in the consumer electronics area. So often from the Japanese perspective, when they look at an American product or a European product, they think it's probably a little bit too heavy, a bit too big, a bit too overpowered for their environments, for their homes, or for the way that they use things. So we do a lot of user-centered research, so ethnographic research, visiting people's homes in Japan, looking at how they use products, and therefore to help the American or European company make some decisions about the kinds of technology that they're using and the way that they design products for that market. So that's the sort of mixture of things that we do. It's a sort of, I would call, in a sense, it's interpretation. It's a kind of cultural interpretation and design interpretation, if you like, different to the kind that you might be doing in terms of language, but at the same time, probably quite similar.
I love that idea of design interpretation, because you're taking different concepts and doing your best to translate them.
A very, very simple example might be back in the early 2000s, I was working with Dell Computer, and they were making these desktop computers for the US and wanted to, at that point, were trying to expand into Japan, and they had these, these quite big desktop computers, which are actually big for an American's desk, never mind a Japanese person's desk, but they wanted to ship them to Japan. And of course, you put one of those on the average cubicle desk in a Japanese office, and there's no room left. So immediately you realize, we need to do something about this. We need to design something smaller, etc., that fits that environment. Otherwise, we won't sell anything. So yes, it is that kind of cultural interpretation, but also functionality and usability and all of those things. Yeah, It's interesting.
Yeah, naturally, as people, we tend to think of culture as more of an interpersonal thing, but tend to really overlook how culture has such a strong impact on environment as well. That's a great thing.
Yeah, it is. There's some really curious ones. I don't know whether kind of getting too much into detail, but there's some. So for example, we've done a lot of work in the area of toothbrush design and those kinds of things. We've done a lot of work with a company called Sunstar, which are based in Takatsuki, who make gum brand products, which you probably know in the US as well as Japan. So over there, if you think about power toothbrushes, which have become very common, I guess, in the US and Europe. So, I think a lot of people are now using these electric toothbrushes. Well, in Japan, if you talk to people, because they feel these imported products, they think that they're very strong and they worry that they're going to damage their gums. So they would tend to buy a Philips or Braun toothbrush, but only use it for a special event. So they wouldn't use it every day. They'd use it before going to a special evening out or concert or something like that, which is really interesting, isn't it? We would tend to use those things every day because we think they're better for your oral care. But over there, they see it as a special, a special activity. So something like that would obviously really impact the sales of, a new product in that market. So it's really important to go and find out what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to see how everybody's perceptions of other people's cultures interplay. It's very interesting to see. But obviously your company works with clients from all over the world doing that sort of design interpretation as well. But in your opinion, what makes the Japanese market unique when you are trying to introduce products into Japan, or when you're trying to make products for companies in Japan in the Japanese market?
Yeah, I think there's the things that we've spoken about, the cultural differences or the usability differences or space differences, those kind of things. I think the biggest thing though is in working with Japanese companies, I suppose the expectations are quite different to working with a European or an American company. And I think that's very much about the different cultures that exist within the companies, and also the sort of, if you like, the educational differences. So I think when you work, especially as a consultant, and I think there's a bit of this exists if you're doing consultant work anywhere, and that is that it's the consultant's job to bring something new or something fresh, or whatever it is. But I think in Japan there's an added element to this. I mean, probably as you know, Japanese like new stuff. They don't. They kind of. You can connect it to all sorts of things like wabi-sabi and all of these kind of things. But essentially, they like new things, and that's actually quite challenging for design, because I think if you're a European or American educated designer, you tend to be trained to think that a level of consistency or that a slow evolution of something is the better way to do something. Therefore, you often don't see a big need to keep changing things, to keep having new things all of the time. Whereas in Japan, they will expect something completely new. And if they don't see it, they'll probably be a little bit unhappy. And so it's actually really challenging, because as a designer, you tend to want to sort of develop a design and a brand slowly over a period of time, because that's a way to build equity in a brand. And I think if you look at the most successful Western companies, Apple's a good example. They've got a very clear design identity. Or if you take a car company, it might be BMW or whatever. Volkswagen is another good example. They don't change overnight. They don't have a black thing one day and a white thing the next day. But in Japan, that's kind of the expectation that actually there should be this big change. So that's really challenging thing to deal with. And it's something fundamental, I think, in the difference in thinking. So you can, if you're not careful, you can have these situations where people can get quite unhappy very quickly, because we don't have a shared understanding of where it is we're trying to go. So you have to do quite a bit of work around that, around that particular point. Not sure that does answer your question. I'm not sure it does directly, but
no, it does, because it brings up something that I'm going to be speaking in very broad strokes, but in general, when we think about Western companies, we tend to associate them with trying to be innovative and making new things. Whereas if you look at Japanese companies, the stereotype is that they are more iterative. They try to make gradual improvements. But it's interesting that on the consumer side, it's different.
Yeah, I mean, but and you also get this. I think you're right. In general, there's a quicker pace in innovation, I think, with an American company or European company compared to Japanese. And I think that's a lot about process. I think, American companies in particular, Silicon Valley in particular, is very good at creating processes that allow you to get somewhere very quickly. And it's very business oriented. And also inside those companies, the different groups which need to come together to make something quickly do that. In Japan, they don't. There's still, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot, there's still this kind of silo-based kind of way that companies are constructed, which slows them down, which is, as you said, where you get to this iterative thing, this iterative way of developing things. So it does seem really slow. But like many things in Japan, there's also these very conflicting things. So people want things new, but then they might say, well, actually, that's too unique. We don't want to be, slow down a bit. We don't want you to be we don't want to go too crazy. We want to be unique, but only just a bit unique. So there are all, as I'm sure you've come across in Japan as well. There's so many sort of conflicted viewpoints when you're working with companies there.
Mm-hmm. Which is why it's so important to hear a lot of different people's points of view on working in Japan.
Yeah.
So are there any other things that you believe individuals who want to do consulting or advising work in Japan should know before they try to break into that industry?
I think the first thing is it's slow. So I think relationships are really important there. And I'm sure you've heard this before from your other speakers. Relationships are incredibly important. It took me about 4 years visiting, meeting, before we had our first project there. And then it was sort of like a tsunami after that, with that particular client. We had this is what I'm talking about, Matsushita, or Panasonic as it's called more broadly. So we spent about 4 years meeting with them, and then there was a huge amount of work over a 5 or so year period. And same with other clients, Nissan and Brother and others. So it just takes a long while. And it's a lot of meeting and greeting and those kind of things. So that's one thing. I think some people imagine you can go for 1 or 2 trips and all of a sudden you're going to be, you're going to have lots of work. But that would be incredibly rare and incredibly lucky. I think it's possible to have a piece of work and you think, wow, this is it. This is the beginning, and then nothing. That happens a lot, I think. So if you don't show the commitment, you're not going to get the reward. I think as you're a language person, I think there's a level of Japanese which is maybe enough versus some sort of level of fluency. I have some friends who've lived in Japan a long time who are incredibly fluent, who think that there's a kind of sweet spot, if you like, in terms of how much you should, how far you should go in terms of your language. I mean, it's an individual thing, isn't it? And But I think definitely to invest your time in some level of Japanese really has a reward, because people just simply feel comfortable. And even if they have pretty good English, they're, as I'm sure you've come across many times, that they're more than happy for you to stumble along in whichever level of Japanese you have, rather than them using their English. So I think that's really worth doing. And even if it's only enough conversation for, perhaps, as you know, the business conversation is difficult, but even if it's just enough Japanese for the bar conversation afterwards, then that goes a long way. One of the other things I would say, and I think you've probably had this in some of your other podcasts, is be yourself. Don't try and be Japanese. Don't try to do what they do. And in particular in design and craft and those areas, they're very good. They're very good at making things. They really know what they're about. If you are being hired as a consultant, they want something else, and they want you to be you. And one of the things that we do really well with is just by being honest with them. So I think that's that's perhaps the global consulting thing, that you don't hire someone from outside to tell you what you already. Well, sometimes you do hire them to tell you what you already know, but you want it from a different viewpoint, So I think in Japan that's just the same. And one of the other, I was thinking about this earlier. One of the other things is, I think I don't know about the US these days, but particularly in the UK, there's a tendency to listen to younger people more than older people. And I think in Japan, there is a respect for older people. So I think wisdom does have a value there, that, they will listen to you if you're a little bit older. But if you are younger, then I think just being strong and being yourself and be confident about what you've got to say is also important. And the Japanese tend to respect that, I think.
Besides some individual level of Japanese, depending on your needs, and then also obviously patience, are there any other skills you think would be useful for people hoping to break into Japan?
Yeah, I think in terms of my industry in design, I think the big ones are around how designers are treated. So in Japan, you have a lot of in-house product designers. So they work for companies like Sony or Panasonic or Nissan, whoever, and there's generally hundreds of them. And generally speaking, their role is to, design new stuff. But historically, that's been very much just about the shape of things, the color of things, that kind of stuff. Whereas in the US and Europe, design is very much more about more of a holistic viewpoint. It's about the strategy, it's about the process, it's about a sort of long view of things. You realize that when you work with companies, and when they're asking for more and more ideas, and you're thinking, hang on a minute, we need to have a big strategic plan about where we're going, then there's this point that somehow these things are not quite rubbing along together. And it's just to do with how designers are viewed in Japan within a company and how designers are educated. I think it took me a long time. I think I had one of those haha moments at some point. And I remember what it was. I think I was in a bar in Osaka somewhere with these people from Panasonic. I just had this sudden realization of what was going on. And I sketched it out on a napkin, what I was thinking, and they sketched out what they was thinking. I realized these two napkins don't really match. So that's one thing. And one of the other things, again, related to design is, unusually when you think of Japan, you think of this highly technologically developed nation, which it is. But if we think about digital technologies, i.e. developing services and apps and those kind of things, it's getting better, but it's incredibly slow compared to in particular compared to Silicon Valley, but also to Europe as well. So those things are always surprising. Are they negative? I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things. You can come away from a situation and think, well, that's ridiculous. But then again, you also have to think, well, actually, they're doing okay. So, maybe it's not so bad. So, but they're just things to be aware of. They're just things that you need to think about when you're working with those companies.
Yeah, being open to noticing those things and then not ascribing a value to them, just acknowledging them as, oh, this is just how things are.
I mean, sometimes you do have to check yourself and say, well, actually, they're doing okay. So perhaps it doesn't matter. It's just different,
Definitely. So I would really love to hear a little bit about your experiences working as a visiting professor in Japan.
Yeah, well, that's been really interesting because I've done similar things over here in the UK and a little bit in the US as well. So I started to work with them, when was it, 3 years ago, perhaps? It's 3 years ago. And basically, it's like an interface between the college and sponsored projects. So they do, like a lot of universities, they do sponsored projects, and they do them with, the ones I've been involved with, I've been with a company called JSAT TV, which is a satellite company, Sony, which everyone knows, Suzuki and Hitachi. So of course, their interest is to work with university students to get some new ideas or new thinking. And from the student's viewpoint, it's a good way to connect with real life, I suppose. And then so my job is to sort of help the students interpret design briefs that they get from those manufacturers. And it's been really nice, I would say. I think there's the students that, I mean, very gifted in terms of working in more traditional ways. So and I suppose what I mean is from a craft basis. So whether that's making something or sketching something or those kind of things. But as I alluded to before, what the component that they really need help with is in how to think about solving design problems. So that's essentially the thing that I try to do with them. So it's simple things like, when you're designing things, you try and put your mind into the position of the user. So is this user 18 or is it 80 or whatever, that kind of thinking. And in addition to that, to help them plan out their projects, plan out their time, plan out the things that they need to do, and to help them create some kind of goal for what it is that they're trying to achieve. So that's roughly what I do with them. Outside of that, Kanazawa is such a lovely place to visit. And it's got such a rich history of craft and so on. So it's it's just always a pleasure to try and work with them. And they generally have an exhibition of what they do, which is usually in Tokyo, in Roppongi. There's a place there called the Axis Building, which is exhibition space, which is owned by Bridgestone, the big tire company. But they put lots of design and art exhibits on there. So every year there's usually a big kind of event and video made and all of these kind of things of the work that we do. So that's roughly what I do. But of course, this past year it's impossible, unfortunately, to be in Kanazawa. So we've been doing, like everybody else, trying our best, muddling along with Zoom and those other things to try and make it happen. So I'm looking forward to next year. Will it be? Hopefully.
Yes, hopefully next year. Fingers crossed. Definitely.
Fingers and lots of other things crossed.
Yes, just cross everything. So based on your experiences then, can you explain a little bit about how the Japanese design education process itself might be different compared to the US and the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spoken about it a bit, but I think it's very craft focused. So it's about developing the skills that you need in order to make something. So that might be just, model making something, or making a piece of ceramic, or hammering a piece of metal, or stitching something together, those kind of things. Whereas the education, which, to be honest, was, when I was at university here, was probably very similar. But at the same time here, there's also been a kind of long history of design as a business tool. So that is also very much part of the education here. So it's how does design connect to business more broadly? So how can design help a business understand what they should be designing in the future? How can design help navigate technology? How can designers understand users and the kinds of things that they need in a product and so on? And then, how do you bring all those together into a product of some kind or other? And of course, more lately these days, it's also user interface design and UX, user experience design and so on, which has become very much part of the overall package. So I think it's starting to happen in Japan, but it's slow, in my opinion anyway. It's slow compared to what's happening here and in the US. So those are the main differences. Having said that, they're very quick to learn, and I think to go back to the folks at Kanazawa, they're a real delight to work with, because they've got a real passion for making, which is, I think, a great aspect of Japanese culture. If you're a craft person, but if you're a designer working inside a big company, then or working with big companies, then you need to understand these other elements as well in order to get things moving, in order to get things made.
Yeah. So then maybe as a result of those educational differences, if an American was hoping to hire a Japanese designer, can you think of any things that they might want to be aware of ahead of time, or might want to watch out for if they have experience working with Western designers and might come in assuming it will be similar?
I think it would only be good. I think it would. The results can only be good. I mean, we always have a Japanese designer working with us, and the results have always for us been good for a few reasons. One is creative capability, if you like. So if you've got a design company, smallish design company, then it's, can be all hands on deck, meaning that, you need to have capability to do everything. So from having a great new idea to making it, and Japanese designers are very capable in that way. And then also for us, because we do a lot of work for Japanese companies or with Japanese companies, then of course their language capabilities, etc., are also incredibly valuable to us as well. So I think it can only be a good thing. And I think all of those other things, those business things, they will quickly, pick up if they're, in and around that environment. I think they would pick up very quickly. Really adaptable, capable people.
So do you have any personal examples of maybe a communication breakdown in Japan that you've experienced due to culture?
Communication breakdown, actual breakdown. Again, probably around expectations more than anything. I've had lots of sort of language breakdowns.
That comes with the territory.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So many of those I can't. Fortunately, I'm not one of the people that worries about them. I just had to, okay, move on. I think mainly expectation breakdowns, as I mentioned earlier. I think those would be the things really that often when you're working with a company, and particularly if it's a smaller one, their expectation is that you're going to find this thing which is, fundamentally going to change their company for them. And sometimes the answer is, well, keep on doing what you're doing. Or the answer is, we just need to make a small change here and there in order to make, X, Y, or Z happen. So I think those are the big things. From their side, there might be the big things. The other side of it is probably around decision making. So inside a medium or large Japanese company, the decision making is what's that word? Labyrinthine? Very difficult. It's kind of at times you see projects just die just purely because they're not able to make, the right decisions internally in the right time. And that's really, really frustrating, because you'll see other companies probably on a similar path having the same idea at the same time and they get it done. And the company you're working with doesn't get it done. Those are perhaps the tricky thing. And there's that great, I've got a couple of good business terms for you. One is which are quite useful to not necessarily know how to say, but to understand the meaning. One of them is do megari, which if you're working with a company and you've got basically continuous conversation, there's no decision point. It just keeps going round and round and round and round and round. So probably you don't want to say that necessarily in the daytime to the boss that you're working with, but maybe in the bar it's okay to discuss it. This is what's happening. And then the other one is o-to-shi-do-ko-ro, which is compromise or where things land. And I think that's a very useful one to learn, depending on the company you're working with. But that's also an incredibly useful phrase when you're working with a Japanese company, trying to find this point. And also, I think regionally you get those different terms, So I think if you're working with companies in Osaka, I've always found that the way I try to think of it is that it's very much a sort of trading place. So this compromise point is, something which you come across quite a lot with companies that are based in that area. Whereas in Tokyo, it's the sort of decision making is a little bit different compared to that region.
Yeah, it's definitely important to be aware that the business culture in Tokyo may not be universal throughout all of Japan.
No, that's right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't think it is. Yeah, I think it is. It's perhaps regionally different. It's company size as well. There are a bunch of other very useful phrases as well, but we probably ought not to talk about them. Another time.
Great.
People will learn them.
Yeah, you will learn them.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of really good and useful takeaways so far in the conversation. But if you were chatting with somebody who was going to Japan for business and they didn't really have time to learn much about the country or the culture, what would you want them to learn before they got on the plane?
Oh, that's a really good one. I think at least learning how to say hello is a good thing to do, because it just shows, in any language, isn't it? Because it just shows respect for the other culture, doesn't it? I still can't get my head around the fact there's many people living in Tokyo still haven't really got around to learning Japanese. So I really can't understand that myself. So I'm the kind of person that wants to at least have some basic capability. So that, I think that's one thing, and patience is another one. And the classic one, which you'll know about very well, is the aizuchi effect. So the constant nodding, the Japanese person's constant nodding of their head doesn't mean yes. It just means, yes, please go on. Or, yes, I'm hearing you. I mean, that's a very useful one to learn, isn't it? Because you do hear, I have heard people visiting from overseas say, well, they seemed incredibly positive. I'm thinking, no, they were just saying, come on, get to the end of your conversation or whatever. So I think that's another good one. And try and enjoy it. I think it's a great place to visit, and to go there and not to enjoy it for what it is would seem, that just seems terrible. To fly in and out and not really understand anything, or not being able to absorb anything of that culture would be a real shame, wouldn't it? I think, anyway.
Yeah, it definitely would. There's, of course, important things to learn ahead of time, but probably one of the other most important things is just to enjoy your time there, like what you said, because it's easy to get very stressed out about doing everything perfectly. When you get to Japan, relaxing is an important thing too.
Although it's much easier now. I mean, I must when I first visited in '96, there was almost no English. It's not that long ago, is it? But it's changed incredibly quickly. So I think for visitors these days, it's actually quite easy to get by. As I mentioned, I think people who live in Tokyo can probably survive without. Well, they do survive with very little Japanese. So I think as a visitor, it is much easier these days, isn't it, to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. It's completely doable, I think.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you feel like we didn't get a chance to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, around language itself, as you know very well, it's it's a lifelong journey, isn't it? I think is what I would say about it. People often ask me, how long you've been studying Japanese. It just feels like the whole of my life, really. So having started in around 97 or 98, I still, to this day, I have a tutor and I continue to learn, and I think it's particularly difficult if you don't live there, of course, because you don't have necessarily the day-to-day opportunity, but I still, continue to do that. And so it's just a great commitment, isn't it? But it's, at the same time, it's also nice when you get, you're able to achieve some small goal or other, depending on what that is. So that, that side of it is almost, I mean, one thing that I've found is that as a lasting part of this journey of sort of working with Japan, I've found that actually the language has almost become a separate thing. I just love doing that separately from however good or bad work is. And then sometimes, work can be frustrating, as we all know, but somehow the interest in the culture and the continuing with language and so on will remain, I think, until I get to some unspecified point, like all of us, where you feel like, I'm good enough now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As with a lot of things, it's the journey, not the destination.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. That's a much nicer way to put it than the way I've kind of just mumbled my way through. But yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Nope, cliches do have their place at times.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they do.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm very excited to share it with my audience. So thanks again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Nice to speak to you. Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation, and please be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode to learn more about David and his company, The Division. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe and leave a rating and review if you enjoyed the podcast. And feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. Also, be sure to reach out if you would like to contribute as a guest on the podcast to share your own cultural insights into doing business in Japan. If you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find the link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo!